Hello and welcome to this video installment of Melendy Avenue Review. And what this is going to be is a reading of my 2021 birthday lecture. Many of you, well, a few of you anyway, have seen the live version, which I've posted to YouTube, which was from my birthday party about a month ago, a little bit more now. And I thought it would be nice to also have a clean version, because while the live version is fun and all, it's also a little bit harder to hear. There's interruptions. It's cool and all, but I figure if I have clean versions of all the rest of them, I could have a clean version of this one. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of birthday lectures, they're lectures that one gives for one's birthday. And you can hear more about the origin of the concept if you go to my first birthday lecture video. And also my other birthday lecture videos are also up on YouTube if you're interested in those. There's a playlist. Okay, with that, I will start this lecture. It's entitled Alternate History at the End of History and Beyond. When I was maybe 12 years old or so, my dad got in maybe his last real zinger on me. And what's more, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean to. After seeing a certain display at a Walden Books, I asked my dad if he knew anything about alternate history. He looked at me, a little puzzled, and asked, "You mean like Howard Zinn?" No, listener, I did not mean Howard Zinn. I had nothing in mind that pointed to me being a good, virtuous little lefty or particularly interested in learning anything useful. When I said alternate history, I meant novels set in worlds generated by asking historical what-if questions. I'm not going to dwell too much on the definitional issue. Arguably, every novel set on Earth in the past or present is an alternate history novel, given that they all posit something happening that did not actually happen, yada yada, and simply say that for the purposes of this lecture, I define alternate history fiction as fiction where a historical counterfactual is a major part of what sells the book to audiences. The usual punt to the power of marketing to define literary categories that critics under late capitalism so often make, but there it is. And it was marketing that drove me to ask my dad about alternate history that day, namely a display of alternate history novels by writers like Harry Turtledove, S.M. Stirling, Stephen Barnes, and other stalwarts of the subgenre. Alternate history fiction in the form we know today came about when the form jumped the track from a plaything for historians, from Titus Livy to Winston Churchill, into the emerging genre of science fiction in the early 20th century. This was in large part due to various conceits that became common in alternate history stories and that are still present today. Time travel, dimension shifting, various divergences in the history of science leading to technological leaps or drags, on and on. But the identification of alternate history and sci-fi was so complete by the time I was paying attention in the late 1990s that alternate history stories without such conceits, where there's no time travel or magic or advanced technology, were still usually considered sci-fi and shelved as such at bookstores and libraries, unless they were written by established literary figures such as Philip Roth or Michael Chabon, both of whom wrote alternate history novels that are generally considered literary fiction, albeit with some genre flavor. Widely admired works of alternate history fiction, including L. Sprague de Camp's Lest Darkness Fall, Ward Moore's Bring the Jubilee, and Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, dot the sci-fi landscape throughout the 20th century. But something changed in the late 1980s, and this change gathered strength in the 90s and early aughts. Alternate history became a mainstay of science fiction. Many authors dabbled in it, but a few became dedicated writers of alternate history science fiction, writing little else, and often cranking out multiple such novels a year. Literary fiction got on the act too, as with the aforementioned works by Roth and Chabon. So did television, in the form of the show Sliders, which began as a show about a group of people forced to travel to a series of alternate dimensions with different histories, but which eventually became a Monster of the Week show. No less a figure than Academy Award-winning actor Richard Dreyfuss co-wrote a novel about an America where the American Revolution did not happen, with Harry Turtledove, published in 1995. They were going to make a movie, but it didn't get anywhere. Just give me a moment here. Newt Gingrich slapped his name on some co-written alternate history novels between 1995 and 2011. Hack historian Neil Ferguson put out a book of virtual histories in 1997. A cheap cash-in that tried and failed to take shots at leftist history, mostly on the basis of the great social historian E.P. Thompson having called counterfactuals ahistorical shit. There was a flourish of alternate history discussion groups, online, on Usenet, on web rings, and so on in this period as well. This moment in the sun for alternate history fiction coincides with two relevant stretches of time. One is my childhood, as well as a portion of that childhood spent reading a lot of alternate history fiction, roughly ages 12 to 18, when I gobbled down works by Harry Turtledove, S.M. Stirling, Eric Flint, and others. I bothered my friends talking about these books, though my friends Miri and Phoebe were sweet enough to take me to see Harry Turtledove speak at a local sci-fi convention. I attempted to write stories in the genre myself, and I made one of my best friends in college when we gingerly admitted, with the shame that 19 can have for 17, our respective alternate history reading phases to each other. The alternate history moment also coincides with an era we now sometimes ironically call the end of history. This is named after one of the great whoppers of bad historical prediction, one so bad you have to figure someone could write a decent alternate history story based on the idea, what if Fukuyama were right? Francis Fukuyama was a neoconservative intellectual who wrote the essay The End of History in 1989, where he suggested that with the impending collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it the dream of communism, history, capital H history in the Hegelian sense, as in conflict over what ideology, should guide politics and society, was over, and that liberal democracy, American style, had won the day. This was turned into a book in 1992, and that book became Aurora Avis, the Hegelian bestseller. You could call the end of history era the period where serious people could buy what Fukuyama was selling. Ironically, Fukuyama himself, one of the more thoughtful of the neocons, was less bullish for the concept than many others. But for plenty of thought leaders at the time, the world was destined to look more and more like America in the 90s as time went on. When did this era end? Some would say 2001 with the 9/11 attacks. While I see that point, I think in many ways a reaction to 9/11 was guided by exactly the sort of people who believed in the end of history thesis, and who also believed that Islamic fundamentalists were just backwash to be mopped up, many of these people being Fukuyama's fellow neocons. 2008, with the financial crash and the resurgence of white revanchism that reared its head with Barack Obama's election to the U.S. presidency, is my general stopping point for the end of history period. The late 80s was also when figures like Harry Turtledove and S.M. Stirling began writing alternate history stories. Arguably, the best alternate history novel of that period, Terry Bisson's Fire on the Mountain, came out in 1988. On the other end of the end of history, the break is less clean, but Harry Turtledove concluded his 11-book series that began with the Confederacy winning the U.S. Civil War with one last novel in 2008. The major figures of 90s alternate history often continue to publish in the subfield, and new writers take up the concept as well, but I think things shifted somewhat as the 21st century wore on. I put it to you that the high point of genre prominence for alternate history occurred when it did due to a concatenation of circumstances that we can see as characteristic of the end of history era. This is not simply a matter of cultural or ideological critique, though that enters into it as well, but it is also a question of material conditions pertaining to the production and consumption of popular art. As these conditions shifted in the post-2008 period, so too did the place of alternate history fiction. A caveat here around the question of high points. I would not say that the alternate history fiction produced during the end of history era is the best alternate history fiction out there. The products of the subgenre of that era range in quality from quite good, like Bisson's Fire on the Mountain, to absolute dreck, like Neil Ferguson's work and much of Sliders. In general, I'd say they tend to be formulaic and kind of on the lower end of mediocre. This was, above all, the era of serieses, as exemplified by the work of Harry Turtledove, who at various points in the 20 years we can call the end of history period worked on no fewer than 8 serieses that could be called alternate history, all of them at least 3 books long, alongside multiple standalone alternate history novels. Other major alternate history writers followed suit, and some of these series, like Eric Flint's Ring of Fire, which began in 2000, are still being written. These series tend to have concepts that did most of the work for them, with action, world building, and characterization varying in quality, but generally being a little pro forma. Whatever their quality, these blockbuster series is, many of them bestsellers that hooked a lot of readers, helped fill out the sorts of chain bookstore displays that first notified me of the genre. This would have been difficult to do with, say, alternate history fiction in the early 1960s, when works like The Man in the High Castle, miles better than any Turtle Dove Potboiler, came out, but weren't understood as representing a discrete subgenre for marketing purposes. So when I say this is a high point of alternate history, I mean it's a high point in terms of genre prominence, not necessarily quality. I argue that things changed in alternate history fiction after 2008 or so, but of course, most stories of historical rupture carry within them elements of a story of historical continuity and vice versa. There's continuity in the story of alternate history fiction across the 2008 barrier, but there's rupture as well. Let's see if we can't parlay continuity into rupture in both the alternate history sphere and the larger historical context. One continuity between our post-2008 period and the end of history era, in which so many of us were born and raised, has been the steady progress of a few economic trends. Rising wealth and income inequality, stagnating wages, and increasingly precarious job security, the delinking of productivity gains from wage growth, and increases in standard of living, the consolidation of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and of corporate power in an ever smaller number of conglomerates. This sadly familiar tale has a bearing on our story in a few ways, in continuity and rupture across the 2008 line, do-si-do with each other in both the realms of alternate history fiction and of the broader political and cultural context. The speculative fiction industry, like the culture industry more broadly, has seen a bifurcation. Big-name writers make big money, usually with big tentpole series, that compete to become movies and TV shows, while millions of others, less fortunate scribblers, find other outlets for their work, increasingly outside of conventional publishing, especially self-publishing and fan fiction. This dynamic was somewhat less pronounced at the beginning of the end of history era in the late 80s than it is today. You could argue that a lot of the alternate history writers of the time existed in a sort of broad middle class of speculative fiction writers, the sorts of people who read and wrote for the pulps back when they were still relevant and who cut their teeth on the expanding paperback market of the mid to late 20th century. But we all know what happens to middle classes when the top decides to rake back their wealth and power and when there's no meaningful opposition to stop them. Arguably, the creators of big alternate history series in the end of history era, your Turtle Doves, your Sterlings, your Flints, made it past that big thresher into the lower strata of the series-producing sci-fi gentry, though they're small fry compared to your J.K. Rowlings and your George R. R. Martins. Inequality and a general feeling of stagnation or decline also spurs discontent. This is true in the literary realm as it is in the political realm, though the linkage between discontent and action can get blurry in the political world, it gets downright warped in the world of culture. In an altogether too neat analog of so many political situations the world over since 2008, the speculative fiction community, in the Anglosphere in any event, has grown its very own red-blue divide. It maps neatly onto the red-blue divide in mainstream American politics, and which spreads like a weird mimetic virus, infecting other political contexts the world over. This setup is complete with a febrile, fascist-adjacent red team and a smug, complacent blue team, and of course masses of people and many pressing questions left out of the equation. This dynamic manifested itself most dramatically in the Puppygate saga, where various coalitions of right-leaning sci-fi and fantasy writers ranging from libertarian contrarian cranks to out-and-out neo-Nazis tried to hijack the Hugo Awards nomination process, one of the big award ceremonies in the speculative fiction community, or else burn the award's credibility to the ground. The different puppy factions, you see they call themselves puppies, so they're ironic, which means they can't actually be terrible pieces of shit, did this out of spite for what they saw as a liberal elite of writers and editors imposing social message fiction on a mass of readers who just wanted spaceships and lasers. Unlike certain other encounters in the 2013-2017 period, in which this Puppygate fiasco took place, the blue team decisively won. N.K. Jemisin, author of the Broken Earth novels and target of much abuse from the puppies as a social justice warrior and a black woman, won 3 Hugos for Best Novel in a row. For now, it seems that the red and blue camps in contemporary sci-fi are here to stay for the foreseeable future, sniping at each other online and conforming more and more to type. The conservative gobbler-up of identikit military sci-fi stories of buff guys in power armor shooting aliens, the liberal mark for any story pitch with an oppressed narrator and a few buzzwords, conforming to type as mutually antagonistic believer communities so often do. It's not strictly symmetrical. The red side, led by the puppy factions, really did harass and try to disrupt the other side in ways that the blues didn't do back to them. If you want your sci-fi to jump the track to mainstream respectability, it does help to have the literary ambitions, social relevance, and better editing, also less cringeworthy cover art of blue favorites like Jemison and Lecky and so on. Though it's worth noting that that doesn't always translate to superior sales numbers, as any number of pulpy populist stalwarts like Jim Butcher or David Weber can attest to. Alternate history fiction enters into this dynamic mostly on the margins. One of the bigger social media brawlers in the notoriously rough playground that is young adult fiction, Justina Ireland, started a young adult alternate history sci-fi series about slavery and zombies, and she does not hesitate to wade into speculative fiction fights on the blue side. Her day job is as a defense logistics professional for a U.S. Navy contractor, as it happens. But most of the big players in high-stakes speculative fiction drama aren't mainly known as alternate history writers. As I will discuss later in this lecture, I don't think it's accurate to say that alternate history theory... that's interesting. Sorry, doing a bit of an edit. I don't think it's accurate to say that alternate history has gone into eclipse since the end of history period, but its place in the genre and the culture at large has changed. This is where the long-suffering listener might be thinking that we're finally going to get into the ideology critique, how alternate history fiction has changed with the changes in prevailing ideology between the late 80s and today. Of course, you all know I'm a materialist, so I throw in stuff about material conditions, but we've read enough left book shared articles to know that now's the time when I lay the ideology bare. Well, far be it from me to disappoint my listeners, but I'm going to play with it a little. I think changes in ideological bent, the values expressed that map more or less neatly onto contemporary set-piece political battles, are only one strand in a braid of ruptures and continuities that run not just between contemporary alternate history fiction and that of yesteryear, but between any set of coordinates in cultural past and present. In short, I'll give you your ideological meat, but also your historiographical veggies. It won't surprise anyone to learn that the main ideological differences between alternate history fiction of its peak period in the 90s and aughts and alternate history today is found in treatment of race and gender. It would be pretty easy and even true enough to say that earlier alternate history had problematic takes on those subjects, and that contemporary alternate history is more woke. Consider some of the plots of big-time alternate history works from the 90s and aughts. Harry Turtledove's The Guns of the South, where Afrikaner militants use a time machine to give General Lee's armies AK-47s. The same author's Southern Victory series, depicting a victorious Confederacy, sans time travel this time. Stephen Barnes wrote a series about Africans enslaving white people to labor in the Americas. And then there's my personal favorite, the Draka series by S.M. Sterling, where American loyalists fleeing the revolution go to South Africa and create a slave superstate that eventually conquers the world. Then consider the premises of recent alternate history hits. Downtrodden 19th century nations use magic and steampunk tech to turn the tables on the imperialists in P. Jelly Clark's work. The ANC and apartheid South African secret police fight over an empathy machine in the work of Dan Wood. Wandering circus folk disrupt a world run by Luddites. Who wrote that one? I didn't write it down, sorry. Dinosaur riding Sioux do dances with wolves, but with dinosaurs instead of horses, with Colonel Custer's son. It's a whole new world. Maybe. But there's complications. Let's look more closely. I've seen people cite the basic premises of these books, especially the older alternate history novels I just cited, as prima facie evidence of the writer's racism and reactionary sentiments, or lack thereof in the case of more liberal-leaning recent volumes. I think it's worth getting deeper in there and exploring what exactly these writers thought they were doing with race, gender, and with politics more generally. Let's start with the material again. The big alternate history writers of the end of history era were all working sci-fi writers who made a living by cranking out a lot of writing, often multiple novels a year, usually in multiple subgenres of speculative fiction, and often had sidelines, writing for TV or for the movies or for the tie-in novels attached to them. Terry Bisson, who wrote the excellent Fire on the Mountain, also wrote the novelizations of Johnny Mnemonic, The Fifth Element, and Galaxy Quest, among others. Many of them have continued that work rate well into the second and third decades of the 21st century. What this means for us is that along with whatever points they are trying to make with their fiction, these guys primarily wrote to entertain. This doesn't obviate the messages within their work, but is relevant to reading them that these writers needed to crank out a lot of prose. They needed it to appeal to an audience, and they needed ways to vary things up to keep their formulas fresh. The model I developed when visiting or revisiting these works is less that any given writer had a line, a defined take on race or sexuality or power or what have you, but a space, a range of ideas they consider sufficiently credible or interesting or just relevant to put into their fiction. So the same guy, S.M. Sterling, who wrote about the white South African slave superstate, also wrote a series about a black lesbian sea commander who uses her samurai swords to fight slavers. After Nantucket in the 1990s gets zapped back to the Bronze Age, it's complicated. The guy who wrote the Africans Enslaving Europeans series was black himself and wrote about different kinds of slavery and their relative issues, etc. Harry Turtledove wrote of a kindly Lee using his AK-47s to create a gently progressive Confederacy in the guns of the South, but ended his Southern Victory series by lazily mapping the story of Nazi Germany onto that of the Confederacy, with black people filling in for the Jews. Let's put it this way. In the mainstream of end of history era alternate history fiction, you will find no careers that argue straightforwardly and schematically, the way we like it to be on the internet, for white supremacy, slavery, misogyny, fascism, etc., if for no other reason than it's hard to just map those onto novel after novel when you need to mix it up in order to keep selling them. So what then is the space of thought in alternate history? What's there and what is not? Well, let's get the obvious out of the way first. Communism is right out. Communism means Stalin, as far as Turtledove and Sterling are concerned, and moreover means weak competitors with liberal democracy and a lame villain next to fascism. No one but fanatical idiots believes in it in their stories, and they're outnumbered by devious secret policemen and ideologues gaming the system. The Draka, the South African master race that Sterling devised, practice a weird kind of slave-driven corporatism, and it's clear that Sterling can more easily imagine that than an end to capitalism, and something like that seems to be the main line for alternate history at the time. There's exceptions. Terry Bisson's cooperativist New Africa, founded by John Brown's breaking of the slave power and Fire on the Mountain, but that was exactly the kind of work that your old sci-fi heads nod approvingly at but never reproduce. Eric Flint, author of the 1632 and 1812 series, was a Trotskyite, but is also clearly one of those dudes who working-classed himself into thinking that working-class revolution is bullshit because the guys in the pickup trucks don't talk about it. His good societies are vaguely social democratic, but revolution to him is getting rid of inquisitors in 17th century Germany, a good first step I grant, and teaming up with the most progressive king around, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, if anyone's playing the home game, and no shit, Oliver Cromwell. It's less that these writers were anti-communist, and more that their visions were orthogonal to seeing any kind of communist or revolutionary horizon, even as a fictional possibility. The radical left option is out of the box in end-of-history sci-fi. The radical right option is not. Genocide, slavery, and the redemption of various right-wing monsters loom all throughout end-of-history alternate history. The redemptive angle is especially worth considering, and here, aspects of vernacular historical thought inherited both from the culture at large and from speculative fiction tradition mesh with timely ideas and concerns to dress up old themes in new clothes. Harry Turtledove premises all of his work involving the Confederacy on acceptance of many tropes of lost cause historiography. Robert E. Lee is a kindly man who didn't like slavery, the importance of states' rights issues over and above the slavery question, the idea that the Confederacy could ever have been a normal functioning country, let alone a superpower, as he depicts it. The Germans eventually joined Team Earth to fight off aliens when aliens invade during World War II and another one of Turtledove's endless series because, as everyone knows, the German army was essentially honorable and smart, unlike that nasty Hitler fellow. The good dictator, the ambivalent slaver, the reluctant mass killer, made to be what they are by circumstances and their realistic acceptance of circumstances, their humanity wrung for pathos on the rack of their fun-to-read-about misdeeds. We see these in a lot of science fiction and fantasy going back to the genre's origins, and the old alternate history guys were thoroughgoing readers of the old-school sci-fi and fantasy we know, and so they followed in the footsteps. Muddles, irony, paradoxes, and the self-congratulatory consideration that wisdom is made up out of muddles, ironies, and paradoxes constitute many of the coordinate points defining the space of alternate history fiction at the end of history. To the extent that there is a hook to these books other than curiosity about the what-if premise and whatever action they boast, it is precisely the made-you-think moment when you are supposed to have when you consider that perhaps the AK-wielding Confederate or the novel-writing slaver soldier isn't so different from you after all. Which is another way in which Fire on the Mountain is exceptional. Terry Bisson's characters really are different along with their world, but still relatable. You can change the set dressing, move borders around on the big risk board, occasionally have more or less political freedom, but the basic structures, capitalism, our concepts of race, sex, gender, and so on, something like the nation-state, do their structuring thing, providing scaffolding for the usual human dilemmas of middling writers. War and peace, love and sex, career ambition, inability to control complex situations, and so on. These dilemmas, in their turn, provide filling in between depictions of battle and the little historical cameo moments for the fans that make up most of the appeal to most readers of end-of-history era alternate history. In many ways, this space of fiction maps onto the general space of politics that the philosophers of the end of history provided, which is also sometimes considered the era of there is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher put it. What we had, and the mental armature that comes with it, is what we have, and it's not going to change. History in this vision becomes a set of dusty museum pieces to be mulled over. If anything, the difference between the alternate history space and what someone like Francis Fukuyama thought about things is that Fukuyama would have understood that in the past, people really did think differently, not just in their opinions about given issues, but in their patterns and concepts, in a way that writers at the time, or now, only seem to fitfully understand. Different thinking in an alternate history novel usually means something like a modern person can rook an ancient person at military strategy if they get zapped back to the past, on the idea that ancient people are supposedly mentally inflexible. That's the level of sophistication at which they generally work. Allow me to fill in the space we've created for end-of-history alternate history fiction a little before we turn to what changed as the 21st century wore on. I see there as being basically two engines for the alternate history mobile as it chugs along, picking up readers on its tour of what it thinks of as a garden of forking paths, but what is actually more like a carousel or Disney theme ride. The first is Harry Turtledove, of course. Like a certain kind of car, you know what you're getting when you pick up a Turtledove novel. You get high-concept what-ifs that can usually be described in one sentence. You usually get some war. War is important to a lot of alternate history fiction from this era, which had few fun conventional wars for nerds to gawp at. You'll get a few awkward heterosexual sex scenes in each book. You'll get disasters, but little really changes save for some borders and who is alive and who is dead. The second engine of end-of-history alternate history consists of online alternate history fans who wrote their own series. These were often better written and more historically rigorous than published alternate history fiction. They often took the form of hybrid works, combining omniscient history book-style analysis with narration from fictional viewpoint characters. They often pushed the envelope, too, with the historical concepts more than your Turtledove types did. In the end, though, a lot of the successful series in places like the Usenet group, soch.history.whatif, can be read as parables of how badly wrong things could have gone had anyone messed with the history that resulted in the triumph of liberal democracy circa the turn of the millennium. An Australian I corresponded with back then wrote Decades of Darkness, the darkness situation being brought on by New England seceding from the Union during the War of 1812 and allowing the rest of America to become what else? A slave superstate. The serial, often considered the crown of the genre for all time, starts with FDR dying, relatively progressive Vice President Henry Wallace becoming president, and a series of disasters occurring due to that, which culminates in nuclear war, mass cannibalism, and Jim Jones becoming U.S. president 30 years later. There's some outliers that deserve talking about too, who did things a little differently but still belong firmly in the literary space we're talking about. One is familiar from a lot of our adolescent readings, Orson Scott Card. Card was big stuff in the 90s, coming off of the success of Ender's Game. In 1987, he began the Alvin Maker series, which was a series of fantasy novels set in a version of early 19th century America, wherein the various magical traditions of its inhabitants work. The first 2 books in the series are actually pretty good, and it's a compelling concept. The reason I bring the series up here is both to point is that it points to a historical. Okay, I see. Sorry, I'll probably have to edit this, won't I? Shit. The reason I bring the series up here is that it points to a historical apotheosis outside of the end of history concept while remaining well within its idea space. The answer to the riddle of how that can be is Mormonism. Any non-Mormon reader of the Alvin Maker series knows the sinking feeling of reading the series, getting into the latter books, and before the action gets stupid as Card becomes a worse writer as the 21st century wears on, it turns into obvious Mormon propaganda. Alvin Maker is going to fix everything, the broken promise of America, by incorporating all of the magical traditions of the continent's inhabitants, white, black, and red, into his anti-entropy super magic and start up a golden city in the West. This sort of redemptive narrative is also seen in his novel Past Watch, where time travelers go back to 1492 and make the indigenous peoples and Christopher Columbus, here depicted as a decent, put-upon striver, become friends. Everyone can get along if they just hear the good news. And then there's S.M. Sterling with his aforementioned oscillation between slave empires and not slave empires. Among other things, Sterling was a participant in online sci-fi discussion groups for a long time. It was notorious for getting in flame wars that led to him being banned from forum after forum. He seems to have calmed down some in the 2010s. He has a Twitter but doesn't really use it that much. This is part of how we know that genocide and slavery aren't just fantasies for him. He would make big Heinlein-esque declarations about how genocide solved many problems, about how Muslims as a whole were an enemy of Western civilization, etc., etc. From what I know of his biography, he's a classic child of late empire, with an Anglo-Canadian dad, no one loved the British Empire like nerdy men from the white settler dominions, and a French mom. So it makes sense why the romance of settler empire, and you see it again and again in his work, not just with the slaver Draka, would appeal so strongly. The reason I talk about Sterling here isn't to own him for being a reactionary. For one thing, he would try to wriggle out of that by pointing to his liberal heroes and reactionary villains. It's true that the Draka get into a Cold War with the United States where he frantically signals that the US are the good guys. Spoiler, the Draka win because they're tougher. It's also true that his time-stranded Nantucketers go around the Bronze Age world freeing slaves. Sterling does seem to see these actors as heroes doing heroic things, but also allows that slavers, Nazis, and genocide-heirs can be heroes too, because heroism is ultimately defined by strength. Beyond the politics, I think, to put it bluntly, Sterling gets off on slavery. His slave empires, the Draka and others, have a lot of sex that Sterling would probably think of as kinky, but which any millennial would instantly ID as fairly standard misogynistic, slavery-based, non-consensual S&M between men and women or women and women. Among the Draka, for instance, Draka men routinely rape slave women, but Draka women, who are liberated in many instances, never seem to rape slave men. Sterling knows where to draw the line, and that's where he stops being horny. At times, Sterling had his good liberal heroes denounce the lack of consent as a concept amongst the Draka or the bad guys in the Change universe or wherever. One is even tempted to believe that Sterling believes it with his brain, if not his libido. But it's also clear that Sterling loves the Draka and loves his settler badasses more generally. They're always tough, they're always smart, they're always sexy. Most of them see the problems with their system but philosophize them away, often with reference to their responsibility to keep things from getting worse. We are supposed to believe this constitutes depth of character. The process of settlement gives life meaning, provides opportunities for mastery, and allows for the good life. The liberals in Sterling's stories often lament the pointlessness of their societies, or else find a substitute for settlement, like space exploration. Sterling's good settlers and slavers are usually from classy old money, and the bad ones are tacky new money, bureaucrats, gangsters, and so on. The slaves have mostly resigned themselves to their lot and are often quite frisky, sexually speaking. You can almost appreciate the lengths to which Sterling goes to make every instance of upsetting a slaver or settler apple cart into a hideous, pointless atrocity, really upping the pathos, if you've got a strong stomach. Here, we see the prevalent patterns of thought in the end of history era rebellionist tragedy coincide with good old-fashioned sexual pathology. This is a good time to Google image search SM Sterling if you want a funny little stinger to the whole thing. As it happens, I could stomach Sterling as a teen. I didn't read the Draka books as they weren't at Borders, and what I knew of them from the forums made me somewhat leery, but I loved and often pestered my friends about the Change series, the ones with Nantucket in the Bronze Age. As it happens, I can stomach him as an adult too, though that's partially because of my training as a scholar of the right and of genre fiction. Sterling is a pretty decent action writer, and writing good battles and fights isn't as easy as it sounds. The sheer verve and gusto of his world-building concepts, and the way he wears his weirdness on his sleeve, even as he seems to think that he's basically a normal guy, can't help but stir my admiration. The first Draka novel in particular is pretty good, because it gets into a genuinely alien headspace. Sterling, I think, did a lot of strange reading in old race theory and reactionary thought before he started the series, and it has good battle action, and critically, it's only about 200 pages. What poisons Sterling's work isn't being a reactionary crackpot, it's bloat and sentimentality. As he got older and more established as a writer, he asked fewer interesting questions, wrote much longer books with a lot of filler, repeated himself, and perhaps in response to the internet interlocutors we know he paid attention to, softened a lot of the edges on his heroes and made his bad guys more capital E evil, both in hammy Disney-style ways, also making the bad guys even rapier. It doesn't work. His shit is still weird and creepy, but it hasn't been in a fun way for a while. But it sold, especially during the end of history period. So, we have a reasonably fleshed out ecosystem of alternate history writing circa the end of history. What happened when history comes back around our admittedly somewhat arbitrary milepost of 2008? Let's once again get the relatively obvious internet-style ideology critique out of the way first. There is indeed a good amount of back and forth pertaining to capital H history in the mode of ideological conflict in contemporary alternate history fiction. Things like slavery and genocide are treated not as just unfortunate aspects of the human condition, but the product of power relationships that deserve to be critiqued and overturned. Many writers put a great deal of attention into matters of representation, what sort of characters they have doing what, and so on. I actually don't see that as a complete break from earlier eras. If nothing else, your old sci-fi guys, including some of the alternate history writers I've spoken about, knew that putting objectionable ideas and actions on characters from put-upon groups helps them get over. But there's a different sort of focus on it now. Sometimes it drives more serious attention to character, sometimes it's tokenism, but I will say the character representation question does seem to eclipse other ways that writers could use to interrogate difficult subjects and create interesting perspectives. Let's see if we can't elevate ourselves beyond the culture war set pieces by going through them. In the ideological conflicts that have roiled the speculative fiction scene in the last 10 years or so, the reactionary side accuses the liberal side of neglecting entertainment in favor of political sermonizing, mostly about identity. This is patently false. Liberal sci-fi favorites like N.K. Jemisin, Anne Leckie, Yoon-Ha Lee, and the rest pack their stories with all the space battles and twisty betrayals you could ever want. Reactionary and liberal sci-fi both seem to borrow from the same basic sources these days. Video games, anime, role-playing games, comic books, and major crossover hits like Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. It's clear that what the puppies and other reactionary fans object to is their inability to project onto heroes who might be women or queer or people of color, even if those people are doing the same sort of spaceship shenanigans, that they supposedly want. What does it mean when the argument over the nature of speculative fiction, which is meant to be an exploration of human and even beyond human possibilities, so often becomes a question of projection, that is to say, one of the more common modes that viewers use to criticize pornography? They don't like this actor because they can't project onto him. They don't like this actress because of X, Y, or Z flaw that they could only care about in their peculiar viewing situation. They can't imagine themselves the captain of this particular spaceship, engaging in this particular mission, being this particular space captain. It's all the same shit. Let's use the sort of internet pronunciamento about the current age that I usually don't like, just as a pry bar to help us understand. The idea of the death of context. Context isn't really dead. Plenty of people understand context, but it's true enough in the case of the projection complainers, either in sci-fi, fantasy, or in pornography. Why should they need any context for their decisions when they're just looking to jerk off? To whom must they explain themselves? Ironically, as the eye of the surveillance machine, of which the internet makes up a large part, steadies its gaze on us, many of us imagine ourselves alone to satisfy our consumer preferences, isolated from all other considerations. It seems clear that more and more of us are incapable of understanding choice in any other way. I see this mode of consciousness as a product of the conjuncture between the maturation of consumer economics in the late 20th century and the concomitant collapse of shared public narratives about how life, politics, society, and much else functions as the Cold War wound down and finally ended. In short, the discursive mode that seeded much of the ideological turmoil in speculative fiction, and I'd argue that is currently eating criticism alive, gathered much of its strands together in the end of history era. So, it's all continuity, right? Joined together by superficial readings, mediocrity, context collapse, and so on? Well, a graph is a continuity. It starts one place, continues on to another. At what point is the graph is the change it depicts significant enough to become a rupture? That's the kind of question that bothers a certain kind of historian. It sort of bothers me, but I won't dwell on it. Spend enough time thinking seriously about history and you'll get used to seeing continuity and rupture together, creating continuities and ruptures out of their opposite numbers. But here's a rupture for you. Intellectual and cultural historians identify the end of the 20th century with the collapse of consensus narratives that dominated public life in America and many other societies in the early and mid-20th centuries. A lot of these histories are pretty good, but they tend to be two-panel comics. First, Americans by and large agree on a broad consensus around what you could call moderate nationalism, anti-communist liberal democracy, gradual progress in terms of equality of opportunity, and so on. Panel 2, people no believe, or if they do, they mean completely different things when they talk about these concepts. But it doesn't make sense it would happen just like that. Rupture and continuity. Science fiction and fantasy in the 20th century has been a site for the exploration of unusual and uncommon ideas, including being a place where the seeds of extremist ideologies understood in mid-century as un-American, mostly on the far right, could estivate, waiting for a better climate. But there is also continuity. In many respects, science fiction held to the idea of a common core of truth, generally identified with science, with the progress of science, and the social progress that is meant, mutatis mutandis, to go along with it, longer than it was necessarily fashionable in more literary publishing circles. Moreover, it seems pretty likely that Francis Fukuyama, when he wrote The End of History, thought he was ushering in a new consensus, at least among elites, not heralding in an age of consensus collapse. Let's get back to alternate history, with the inevitable exception of Terry Bisson, who was an old SDS and anti-fascist hand, it's worth noting. The major alternate history producers of the end of history era, even if they didn't buy or even know about Fukuyama's proclamations, all in their way pay tribute to the last thing that could pose as a consensus picture of history: the progress and triumph of liberal democracy, capitalism, and Western science and technology, even as they honor in the breach by creating alternate history scenarios where everything goes the other way. Even Fukuyama thought the end of history would prove tiresome, especially for people who dig war, like most sci-fi nerds do. The consensus picture of history is the negative against which the alternate history scenarios of the end of history period could be read. I don't think it's a total coincidence that this was also the height of the subgenre's visibility. A rupture within a continuity. Many of the big names of alternate history fiction from the end of history era are still plugging away in the genre. Eric Flint turns out stories of his West Virginia mining town democratizing Europe after getting zapped back to the 30 Years' War. S.M. Sterling has a series about Teddy Roosevelt winning the presidency in 1912 and starting the CIA, but cooler early. Harry Turtledove, who really has seemed to have given up, wrote a story about Stalin being raised in the U.S. but still doing all of his Stalin stuff as U.S. president, despite his life being completely different from babyhood. Where do these guys figure in the ideological conflict that has occurred in sci-fi fantasy in the last 10 years? You'd figure they'd be involved, especially Sterling, given his documented love of online flame wars. The answer: almost nowhere. Sterling used to try to start fights with left-leaning writers early in the period, but seems to have settled down of late. Occasionally, given what the Draka series looks like, left-leaning writers use his work as an example of what reactionary sci-fi is, but he's a third stringer in that regard next to gaudy assholes like Ted, Vox Day, Beale. Some commenters use Eric Flint's allegiance to the publisher Baen, which publishes a lot of the major reactionary military sci-fi writers, as proof that Baen is beyond ideology, given Flint's background as a Trotskyite organizer. Turtle doves nowhere to be found. I tried to find commentary among the Puppygate types on alternate history. It doesn't seem to be something they've thought a lot about. And if they're not thinking about it, their opposite numbers, speculative fiction liberals, aren't thinking about it much either, even as some produce alternate history fiction themselves. The alternate history greats of the end of history era are now, like so many of our legacy cultural institutions, seemingly going mostly on inertia. What does alternate history mean in a situation where there isn't really a consensus idea of what actually happened in history? You could argue that many of our fellow citizens are essentially living in alternate history fiction scenarios already. Here I draw a distinction between people living with inaccurate ideas of the past in their head, which is everybody, and people collaboratively recreating history according to standards that the participants may think are those of actual history, but are actually most of the same standards that go into creating genre fiction. Entertainment value, emotional satisfaction, potential for viral spread. Think QAnon, but that's only an extreme example. We have also seen a collapse of genres, along with context and consensus history. Alternate history becomes one trope among many and easily mixed with all kinds of others between and across genres. You can index this to the rising prevalence of alternate history fiction that throws fealty to science out altogether. There was always magic, or what amounted to magical technology, in alternate history fiction. Most of the time before our current era, the magic was restricted to a single moment. Something gets shifted in time. A single advanced technology becomes available, and we follow the historical changes that result. Stories where magic and ultra technology exist throughout the story as part of the setting are much more prevalent in alternate history fiction written now. Alternate history writers of the late 20th century were among the first to seize upon the possibilities of alternate dimensions in the many worlds interpretation, as shown by subgenre progenitor H. Piper Beams, I always get his name wrong, Paratime Patrol, the inevitable alternate dimension cop series by the inevitable Harry Turtledove, and so on. But the many worlds come into their own, not with the schematic stories of the late 20th century, where, with few exceptions, there was a stable reference point, America circa whenever the piece was being written, but with contemporary sci-fi, and not high-end writers either. Those of you who think I'm a genre snob, hear me now. Comic book fans and fan fiction people get many worlds. They grok it, to use a term from an old sci-fi lion, in ways that the old sci-fi masters generally did not. You have to hand it to them. They navigate a world of few stable reference points. Sure, there's canon, but who cares about canon? Your real fan fiction head keeps a great many realities in their minds at once, Lord love 'em. Horniness, narcissism, obsessive completism, and pedantry have driven your true fan into a mental space that had precursors before the 2008 breach, but really only came into its own after. Alternate history scenarios then became so many branches of the noosphere, the realm of ideas, nothing separating them from Tolkien's Middle-earth or any other product of the human imagination, from the world of QAnon for that matter. I suppose if there's a thesis here, it's to say that the late 20th century, arguably the whole second half, was a time of unusually strong divides within the noosphere that people believed in, and that many of those divisions have since collapsed, leaving us in the situation we're in today. After all, who's to say that somewhere in the many worlds of ill-understood quantum physics, there isn't a Middle-earth, or a world where JFK Jr. faked his death to battle the deep state, or the scariest world of all, wherever the fuck the brave little toaster happens? Well, physicists are to say, but who cares about what a Stephen Hawking might have to say next to what a Rick Sanchez offers our imaginations? In the collapse of consensuses for the definition of genre to the understanding of history, we have a freedom that has naturally led to an effervescence in alternate history fiction, and in speculative fiction and art more generally, right? Of course we did. Just like how the internet democratized information, made people much smarter and less susceptible to misinformation. To use an expression from the end of history period and my youth, not. Contemporary alternate history fiction is mostly pretty lousy, much like the alternate history fiction of the late 20th century. Most of it abandons efforts at being historically rigorous, which would be fine, a good thing even, if they did anything especially creative with it, which they usually don't. You wind up with a lot of just so stories and tedium, at least in part, I think, due to the shadow of YA fiction and other influences that don't especially encourage critical thought about what a given writer is really doing. Contemporary alternate history fiction tends to be shorter than the great honking long series of yore, which is nice, I guess. Here's a suggestion. Maybe instead of adopting a single story or just giving the nod to any story that comes down the pike, we apply our critical capacity. We acknowledge that there's a reality that we live in, that not everything is equally true or untrue, but also that we have imaginations capable of seeing things that aren't there for a reason, to imagine possibilities and impossibilities. Maybe we could try out some old ideas and some new ones as something other than set dressing. The first one that comes to mind is the dialectic, the creating of new ideas through the opposition of existing ones, like that between our concrete realities and our limitless imaginations. Maybe games are better with rules because everyone can play, and everyone can make new ones. Everyone can make house rules with their friends. Maybe we could try communicating, but first we'd have to come up with something to say. When we do, then we can walk onto the paths of the many worlds as though we belong there. And that's it. Thanks.